Well, hello there. Father Francis here, and yes, I'm going to do a movie review of this new, fun, and fascinating film, Sherlock Holmes, which came out on December the 25th, Christmas Day, starring Robert Downey Jr. and Jude Law. But before I do that, would you please permit me to slip into something a little more, shall we say, Holmesian? And here we are. We're back again. Now let's be honest. Those of us who are diehard Sherlock Holmes fans, how many of us have not longed to don the old deerstalker, brandish a briar, and manipulate a magnifying glass in order to solve a mystery? Well, obviously, these famous props are synonymous and instantly recognizable as belonging to that world's greatest consulting detective, the literary creation of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. What I thought I would do before I give my little review on the new movie is maybe have a little retrospective of some of the actors that have played Holmes. And these are actors that I have seen or even heard on radio or cassette tapes who have played the great detective. I think it's safe to say that this actor here is synonymous as being, or is known as the quintessential Sherlock Holmes. Of course, we're talking about Basil Rathbone as the great detective. And his sidekick, the bumbling, stumbling, but oh so lovable Dr. Watson, Nigel Bruce. Now, there have been, again, many actors who have played the great detective, and I was going to say through the decades, but I can actually say through the centuries, because we're now in the 21st century, and in the 20th century, there were a lot of people who certainly played the great detective. And here are just a few notable ones that I remember watching as I grew up as a small young boy, and then as a young man, and now as a very old man. Peter Cushing played the great detective. He had many, I think he starred in many Sherlock Holmes movies. Arthur Wantner played Sherlock Holmes on television in the 1950s. Sir Robert Stevens played Sherlock Holmes in the movie The Secret Life of Sherlock Holmes. Believe it or not, Leonard Nimoy, that's right, you Trekkie fans out there, played the great detective, as well as Brent Spiner. Commander Data also donned the deerstalker and caressed the calabash as well. Also, we have Nicholas Rowe, who may be very familiar to some younger viewers, is playing in the Steven Spielberg classic, The Young Sherlock Holmes, which incidentally, this movie was one of the first Sherlock Holmes movies to employ some special effects, some CG generated characters. And in addition to these other fine actors who have portrayed Sherlock Holmes, we even have a few other people who have tried their hand at a 7% solution. Seems like everybody wants to get into the act. But I have to say, and I'm sure some of you are already saying, wait a minute, you forgot. No, I didn't forget. Of course, I have to say the late, great Jeremy Brett, who played Sherlock Holmes. And I have to say, to this point in my life, the Jeremy Brett character, although, you know, Basil Rathbone's in a league all by himself, and I'm going to explain that in just a moment. But Jeremy Brett not only played the great detective in such an inimitable way, but one of the things that Jeremy Brett did, which no other actor who has played Holmes, at least to my knowledge, on film, maybe on radio perhaps, but he's the only actor to date that has actually played Holmes in all of the Sir Arthur Conan Doyle stories. No other actor, I don't think, has ever played the true Holmes from the actual books. Now, granted, they were screenplay adaptations, but they pretty much stuck to the original stories. Now, the Basil Rathbone stories, and again, there are a lot of people who kind of might be a little offended. But the true Conan Doyle purists were the first ones actually to raise their hackles at the fact that these were not true Sir Arthur Conan Doyle stories that involved the great detective. And they were written by, I think, Anthony Boucher and Dennis Green. But, okay, granted, I'm not going to try and compare Basil Rathbone with Jeremy Brett. I think that would be ridiculous. Both played Holmes. Both are great actors in their own right. And there's just nothing you can say that can really take away from their portrayal of Sherlock Holmes. It's interesting. In some regards, there are times that Basil Rathbone looks more like the Sherlock Holmes of the Sidney Paget pictures. But then there are times that Jeremy Brett captures another element of the Sidney Paget drawings that he did for The Strand. But again, both actors, I think, kind of have their own equal weight. But I would have to say, as from a purist standpoint, the Jeremy Brett portrayals of Holmes, I think, obviously stuck a lot closer to the actual story. Now that I've had my little review of the great actors who have portrayed Sherlock Holmes through the centuries, let's talk about the movie. Now, I know some people out there are probably saying, but wait a minute, you just said that Jeremy Brett was probably the best Sherlock Holmes because he was the most faithful to the Conan Doyle stories. And clearly this movie is not a Conan Doyle story at all. That is true. However, if you will allow me, there are many, many Conan Doyle elements that help to make this a really great story. The first element is setting the scene. This movie sets the scene just like a Conan Doyle story. A friend of mine said that they felt gritty when they left the theater last night, or the night when they watched it. And I have to say, I felt exactly the same way. Because when you look at the film, there is a grittiness, there's a reality to it. You feel like you are really a part of the scene. Most of the good Holmes movies and TV shows did that. The Basil Rathbone movies did that, as well as the Jeremy Brett TV Granada series did that. They really set the scene, and this movie does exactly that. Another element that is fascinating for me is the believability. And one of the things that I have to say, and I want to just say this as in passing, because I think it's, for me, is one of the most fascinating things about the film. Might seem kind of silly to some people, kind of trivial to some. But Robert Downey Jr., I've seen him in many films, and I have to say that he's not really one of my great, I'm not a big fan. But after last night, after seeing him portraying Sherlock Holmes, I am absolutely amazed at how he was able to affect the stentorian, sonorous, aristocratic voice of Sherlock Holmes. And so, again, there is a believability about this world. The other thing that's fascinating, and it's also, I think, a Conan Doyle element, I've watched a lot of British detective series in the last 2 years, starting with Inspector Morse, Inspector Lewis, Hercule Poirot, Campion, Dangerous Davis, The Last Detective, and DCI Tom Barnaby, not to be last but least. And all of those, all these are great detective series. I love them to death. But there's a difference. In most of these, you're trying to figure out who the bad guy is, who the killer is. But I think it's fascinating that in most of the Sherlock Holmes films, you already kind of know who the bad guy is. But what you're trying to do is you're trying to figure out, how did he do it? We know who the bad guy is in this new film. You know, just like you know who the bad guy is, it's Professor Moriarty, or it's some other villain, you know. And so the fascinating thing is not so much who is the evil one or the bad guy, but how does he do his brand of evil, and how does he, how is he concocting these elaborate schemes? And so that's where it really draws you into the story. So these are just a few of the elements that go into making, I think, this Holmes very interesting. So forgive me for saying, but it's all elementary. Well, again, thanks for your time, and I hope you enjoyed this little movie review from yours truly, Father Francis. Bye-bye.